أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. What we have to look at today, is the matter of the so-called genocide of the Armenians in relation to a law which has been passed by the House and Senate, the Assembly and the Senate of the French Republic. In a situation like this, one has to go into the depth of the matter to be correct to the accused and also to be correct to the people making the claim of the crime. Now, before we begin, I'd like to say that the fact that I have to do this, I consider an evidence against the grave dereliction of duty of the Turkish President. The President has a major responsibility in this, in that he has dismally failed to confront the issue with the correct weight and authority, knowledge and research befitting the head of a great state, especially one with such a historic and distinguished history as the Osmanli state, which was turned into the nationalist Turkish state by Mustafa Kemal. Now, in this, he has dismally failed a very important prime minister, the most important prime minister in the history of the Kemalist state and its constitution. However, any action that is taken in the future has to bear in mind that Turkey has a burden much greater than any accusation coming from another country, in that it is crippled with the Kemalist constitution and with its historical denial, not of genocide on a foreign people, but by a society which was started by a man who is guilty of something maybe greater than genocide, which is linguicide, because Mustafa Kemal destroyed the great Osmanli language and reduced it to a kind of equivalent of basic English was reduced after during World War I and World War II. Now, also in the creation of that state, Kemal is responsible for handing over large swathes of territory that had come under the jurisdiction of the Osmanli to foreign powers, and especially the great powers of Europe. By the time he was finished, Turkey was dramatically reduced from what it had been as an empire of the Osmanli. And this reverberates on the state of Israel and the state of Syria. What is now the state of Israel was part of the Waqf of Sultan Abdul Hamid on Jerusalem. Syria was handed over lock, stock and barrel and was then fought over by the dogs of war. France and England fought over it for years. And now it's impossible for a Kemalist constitution-based state to speak up for the Syrians when they are the ones who abandoned them in the first place to this ghastly destiny. The truth of the matter is that the constitution the Turks have is as out of date as Stalin's constitution, as Hitler's constitution, and indeed as were the constitutions of the so-called democratic republics of Europe, all of which have been radically revised since 1945. So this dilemma goes deep, deep into the unsolved business of Turkey today, and in a sense, facing Turkey today, the abandonment, the ill treatment, and the oppression of the Kurdish people is a greater scar than the Holocaust of blood at the turn of the century, which involved more dead Muslims than it ever did dead Armenians, as we shall see. So in the light of that, we now have to turn to the matter of genocide. Now, when we ask, well then, what is genocide? We go to the Oxford Dictionary and we find genocide from genos, the Greek, meaning race, and so it's genocide is it defines it as the annihilation of a race. But then we find that the word came into existence in 1944. So it is not a word that has any sort of history. It's an entirely created word. Then we discover that a gentleman called Raphael Lemkin, who was a Polish lawyer, a Jew, who wrote a book called Axis Rule in Occupied Europe. And in that book he defined the term genocide as the aim of the annihilation of annihilating the group. This was published in 1944, as we've seen from the Oxford Dictionary, by the Carnegie Endowment. So it's not a scientific term, it's a political term. Now, we find in Harry Scott Gibbon's book, The Genocide Files, where he gives a detailed scientific study of the massacre and murder of Muslims in Cyprus during the uprising of the Greeks to take command of the island, headed by the Christian Archbishop Makarios. Gibbon says, the civilized world, as the Western nations call themselves, do not like that word genocide. Foreign correspondent Tim Sebastian told why in an investigation into Serb atrocities during the Bosnian War and the Dayton Peace Agreement. On February 25th, 1996, an indictment of the appalling callousness with which the war crimes had been ignored, there were, he reported, Sebastian reported, up to 250,000 people killed, 150 mass graves, over 900 places of detention where more than 500,000 are reported to have been held, an estimated 20,000 women raped, and 50,000 people tortured. It is a pattern of systematic and meticulous barbarity. And why will there be no punishment for this genocide? Sebastian stated that a United States official told him, quote, at all costs, the Western nations had to stay away from the word genocide, the G word. So they called it ethnic cleansing instead. You could not say genocide because that would have required them to act under the United Nations Charter. they would have had to do something to prevent it. Genocide was the whole reason the United Nations was set up in the first place. This means that the logical conclusion of the legal act of the French Republic is to take Turkey to face the charge of genocide and to take sanctions against them as punishment. Now, you see, here we have genocide, the ethnic cleansing in northwest Bosnia. Nothing was done. You see, when the peace agreement was signed, the so-called Dayton Peace Agreement, I was present with General Alagic, may Allah be pleased with him and merciful to him. And I said, General Alagic, I have one question to ask you. At the Dayton Peace Agreement, was one single Muslim military commander present at the signing of the peace treaty? In other words, the combatants, were they represented? He looked at his companions and they all bowed their heads. And General Alagic said, not one military commander attended the Dayton Peace Agreement. It was cut, tried and signed by passive politicians who had no part in the struggle. Genocide is a political term. Here we have a study by Reynald Secher called A French Genocide, which is a study of the Vendée and the horrific atrocities and the slaughter of men, women and children, the destroying of villages, the wiping out of a whole people in the Breton Nantes district of western France. And I can speak of this with the authority that one of my own ancestors, he and his wife were tied together, naked, put in a boat and put on the river, and they drilled holes in the boat and they were drowned in the river, victims of this genocide that the French themselves have never answered to, but on which the modern republic is based. It is based on the acceptance of that genocide, and carved onto the summit of the Arc de Triomphe on the Champs-Élysées is the general who led the genocide, placed there on the orders of Napoleon. Now, we come to the matter of the Armenians. Now, first of all, in Istanbul, I received this book from my bookseller in Istanbul. This is a book published in Osmanli, recounting the struggles of the Osmanli state with the Armenian people. What it evidences is, of course, that this took place over 100 years when the whole of the Balkans was in an uproar and the Osmanli Dawlat was being torn in shreds by the Western powers and Russia, as we shall see. Now, again you have to ask, where was the President of Turkey in examining this issue? Where is the evidence of a single document that he has put forward, not only to defend the present Ataturk state, but also the honor of the history of the Osmanli Turkish people? Here is the book, Death and Exile, the Ethnic Cleansing of Ottoman Muslims from 1821 to 1922. Again, the publisher would not permit the term genocide to be used. So we're going to look at some of the excerpts of this book, and I tell you, it is profoundly researched, enormous detail, and all the most important documentation is from treaty documents of the Western powers. Therefore, it's not partisan Turkish nationalist propaganda. In a note at the beginning, he tells in Thomas Gordon's History of the Greek Revolution, he quotes that in Alison Phillips' War of Greek Independence, 1897, it says, quote, "In April the insurrection of the Greeks was general. Everywhere, as though at a preconcerted signal, the peasants rose up and massacred all the Turks, men, women and children, on whom they could lay their hands. In the Morea they sang, 'In the Morea shall no Turk be left, nor in the whole wide world.' Thus rang the song from mouth to mouth, announcing the beginning of a war of extermination. The Muslim population of the Morea had been reckoned at 25,000. Within 3 weeks of the outbreak of the revolt, not a Muslim was left, save those who had succeeded in escaping to the towns." The author goes on to explain, "For their part, the Armenians in Ottoman Anatolia also first showed their loyalty to the Russian cause by acting as spies for the Russians. Armenians from Anatolia crossed the lines and reported on Ottoman troop movements in all the East Anatolian wars. Anatolian Armenians assisted invading Russian armies in 1827. Many thousands followed the Russian army out of Anatolia when they left. During the Crimean War, Armenians brought intelligence out of besieged Kars to the Russians. Armenian guides from Ottoman Anatolia led the Russian invaders in 1877. The Armenians of the Eleskurt Valley welcomed the invading Russian armies, and when the Russians retreated, they left en masse with them. Scattered throughout the southern Caucasus and eastern Anatolia, the Armenians were in a clear majority in no large region in 1880. The Armenians lived in and claimed as theirs the same land as the Muslims. It was this fact that allied them with the Russians, for without Russian assistance, an Armenian homeland was unattainable. He says also that Erivan, approximately the area of the present Armenian Republic, was until 1827 an Iranian province with a Muslim, primarily Turkish, majority. The destruction or forced migration of Muslim populations allowed the Russians to repopulate the region with Armenians from Iran and the Ottoman Empire. Here's a report during this whole epoch, you see, of incredible anarchy and chaos and bloodshed across all populations. In 1877, it says, this is signed by the representatives of the Manchester Guardian, the Frankfurter Zeitung, Journal des Débats, République Française, Wiener Tagsblatt, Illustrated London News, New York Herald, Daily Telegraph, Manchester Examiner. They said the signatories representing the foreign press have gathered together at Shumla, 20th July 1877. they believe it their duty to affix their signatures to a collective summary of the accounts sent to their newspapers of inhumane acts perpetrated on the innocent Muslim population in Bulgaria. They declare that they have seen with their own eyes in Razgrad and in Shumla children, women and elderly who have been wounded by lances and sabres. They were not wounds that could be attributed to the hazard of battle. The victims gave accounts of horrible treatment inflicted by Russian troops, quite often by Bulgars. They declared that the entire Muslim population of many villages had been massacred, either as they fled or in their pillaged villages. The undersigned state that the greatest number of the victims are women and children who have been wounded by the lance. The English consul Calvert at Edirne, a document to the ambassador Layard, 19th November 1878. The Muslim peasantry despoiled of lands, houses, cattle and other property, a process which has been carried on from day to day, made to live for the most part in stables and outhouses, and now reduced to utter beggary, are exposed to more and more searching spoliation, carried out by means of torture and application of heated iron to the victims, or of beating to the point of death, as in that of Koistik, where the deed was committed by an officer of the Russo-Bulgarian gendarmerie. The Bulgarian hatchet, knife and club are meanwhile busy everywhere. It is a literal fact that every Christian is free to violate any Turkish girl or woman at will, and that the Christians exercise to the full the license accorded to them. Another English witness, Mr. Cullen, said that the treatment the Muslims received was from savages. The constant accounts I receive, he said, of Russian and Bulgarian cruelty is beyond anything I have ever heard or seen in this dreadful war, although, as you know, I have seen much, and I can come to no other conclusion but that the Russians are carrying out a fixed policy of exterminating the Muslim race. Now we're looking at the Russo-Turkish War of 1877 to 78 and the Balkan Wars. They said the Balkan Wars were disorganized but no less lethal. All the Christian allies engaged in large-scale massacres of village Muslims. For example, in the region of Avret-Hisar and Doiran, Bulgarians carried out extensive massacres. In Rajanova, scarcely a male Muslim was left alive. All the males of the village of Kurkud, along with many of the women and children, were collected in the mosque and in barns and were burned to death. In Demir Hisar, 64 Turks were gathered together and burned to death in a coffee house. Serbian komitajes flogged the Muslim villagers of Drenova to death. In the two districts of Yuma and Dibra alone, more than 2,000 Muslims were massacred by Serbian troops. Western observers estimated that approximately 5,000 Albanian Muslims were killed between Kumanova and Usku, and 5,000 in the Pristina area. In Doiran, 59 Muslims were killed when the city surrendered without resistance, and many were murdered in the surrounding countryside. Mass burning was also the method of execution chosen by Bulgarians for the Muslim inhabitants of Rainova, Kilkis and Plansa. Turkish Muslims in Thrace were murdered in great numbers. Some Western European observers put it at more than 200,000 people. Greeks, for their part, took Turks from all over the Kaza of Pravishta to the ravine of Kasrub and murdered them and left the bodies as witness of their deeds. In Albania itself, we find that observers of the European Commission of Control, which had been sent to Albania, reported incidents of mass murder of Muslim civilians. There were numerous other claims by local Muslims of massacres of villagers. The European Commission of Control, which had been sent to Albania to supervise events and watch the creation of the new Albanian state, collected information on the effects of the Balkan Wars on Albanian Muslims. Remember, all of this is the ripping apart of the harmonious Osmanli Dawlat at the hands of the victors of a European war. And remember, as one academic remarked, if the Osmanli state had not been tolerant to Christianity and Judaism, there would not have been this set of massacres. In other words, because they left them in peace, that these people then turned on them and massacred them. In one report, the British representative, Mr. Lamb, included a table of Muslim losses in 102 villages of the eastern district of Albania, which included 2,044 people massacred, 2,800 houses burned, and 25,000 animals carried away. Now the Armenians. Remember, all this is happening at the same time, from Bulgaria, right across Greece, right over Anatolia, into the mountains of Ararat. Professor McCarthy says, the conflict between Muslims and Armenians of the Ottoman East, which had been developing for 100 years, came to a climax during World War I. Two wars were fought at the same time in the East. A war between Ottoman and Russian armies, and an intercommunal war between Armenians and Muslims of eastern Anatolia and the southern Caucasus. In terms of civilian and military losses, the wars fought in the East between 1914 and 1920 are among the worst in human history. The result of Ottoman weakness, Russian imperialism, European meddling, and Armenian revolutionary nationalism. The result was widespread devastation. After the war, cities as Van, Bitlis, Bayazit, and Erzincan were largely rubble. Thousands of villages were destroyed, millions died on both sides. The Armenians, who revolted to gain a nation, were left with a Soviet republic in which they were not their own masters. He said the Armenian revolt in eastern Anatolia began as soon as the Russians realized that the Ottoman Empire would go to war. Before Russia declared war on November 1914, Armenian guerrillas had already begun to organize into guerrilla bands. In preparation for revolt, Armenian revolutionaries had stored vast stockpiles of weapons, largely provided or paid for by the Russian government. And you will see these photographs in the book that I've been referring to, the Osmanli text. In the city of Van, the first to be singled out for assassination, seem to have been the Ottoman civic and religious leaders and their families. This follows a pattern seen in the Balkans, killing first those who might have organized opposition, and indicates a degree of planning. However, the Muslims of Van were effectively destroyed long before they could organize any resistance, and the hideous tortures inflicted on the notables could only have been the product of intense hatred. Everything Islamic in Van was destroyed. All the mosques were burned or torn down. The entire Muslim quarter was destroyed. When the Armenian work and the battle between Ottomans and Armenians were finished, Van more resembled an ancient ruin than a city. When the Ottomans evacuated Van, most of those who had been able to flee were set upon by Armenian bands on the roads. Approximately 400 from one group were killed between Erkis and Adelchevas. Armenians also killed 300 Jews who tried to escape towards Hakkari. That's Van. Then in Bitlis, the Armenians of Bitlis rose against the Ottomans in February of 1916, immediately before the Russian advance to the city. The massacre of Muslims began and continued until the first Russian occupation. In the city itself, Muslim men, women and children were hunted down and killed in the streets. Villages were destroyed and the inhabitants massacred by Armenian guerrilla bands operating behind Osmanli lines. Others were destroyed by Armenian and Cossack bands operating as advanced units of the invading Russians. Special care seems to have been taken to kill agents of the Ottoman government who were caught. The worst Armenian massacres of Muslims and destruction of Muslim villages took place in two periods at the beginning and end of the First World War. The first period began with the entry of the Ottoman Empire into the war and the beginnings of organized Armenian rebellion against the Ottomans. It ended with the Russian conquest of eastern Anatolia in 1916. Muslim villagers suffered from the depredations of deserting Russian soldiers, but they suffered far worse from the Armenians who were left in charge. After the Russians departed, nothing held the Armenians in check. The events of the first period of the short Armenian rule were of a type seen all too often: murder of unarmed Muslim villagers, kidnapping of villagers who were never seen again, destruction of Muslim markets and villages, plundering and rape. An Austrian reporter, Dr. Stefan Eshnani, reported that all the villages from Trabzon to Erzincan and from Erzincan to Erzurum are destroyed. Corpses of Turks brutally and cruelly slain are everywhere. I am now in Erzurum and what I see is terrible. Almost the whole city is destroyed. The smell of the corpses fill the air. A list of Muslim villages destroyed by Armenians in the last months of World War I would be long, as would be the list of the massacred. Whole regions, especially areas along the lines of march of retreating Armenian soldiers, were destroyed. Villages were burnt and dynamited, populations destroyed, populations slaughtered. The methods of extermination differed. For example, Armenians killed 50 Muslims of the Erkinis village north of Erzurum. The rural town of Hasankali was burned to the ground and those who could not flee were killed. In villages such as Sarlipaza, Akilisi and Inisil, Armenians slowly murdered the population over a long period. In others, such as Kukutlu, 300 were reportedly massacred, Armenians rode into the town and massacred the Muslim inhabitants all in one day. One report says the Armenians took approximately 50 Muslims from the Erkanis village of Erzurum and killed them. In the village of Hasankale and vicinity, the Muslims were murdered with bullets, axes and knives. Girls were abominably used and taken away by the Armenians. He looks at the end of the conflict and he says, the crisis died down as the French military appeared on the scene. So again, they were the vultures ripping the flesh of the Osmanli Empire. Turkish villages, some armed with captured French weapons, held off the French and Armenian attacks. So what we find is that at the end of the affair, the French and the Armenians were fighting together against Turkey. In the cities and villages of the southeast, French troops and local Armenians burned Turkish houses, pillaged buildings and raped Muslim women, murdered Turkish civilians. Arms were confiscated from Muslims and given to Armenians. Nevertheless, the Turks began to arm and to resist. Events came to a head in March of 1920 when Turkish forces retook Maraş from the French. In the battles and massacres that accompanied the reconquest of Maraş, thousands of Turks and Armenians were killed. The city was largely destroyed, mainly due to French bombardment and deliberate incendiarism. Remember, this is 1920. This is France totally behaving in a colonialist way, because they had the only sanction they had were by these politicians carving up the world to divide it between France, Britain and Russia. On their retreat, the French colonials and the Armenians destroyed all the Turkish villages in their path. In the words of the American High Commissioner, Mr. Bristol, he said the majority of troops were made up of French colonial forces and of Armenians. They burned and destroyed many Turkish villages as punitive measures in their advance, and practically all Turkish villages during their retreat from Maraş. So in the last stage of the matter, we find the French and the Armenians slaughtering and raping and murdering, and they are now united in declaring that the Muslims have been guilty of genocide. Here are the statistics. These are basically taken from the Lausanne Treaty documents. It's highly researched, and all the figures are conservative. In the reference to refugees, every time I give you a statistic of refugees, there are how many refugees set out. But it is assessed that 1/2 to 2/3 of refugees never arrived at any destination. So the Greek rebellion, civilian murders, 25,000. Refugees set out, 10,000. Crimean expulsion, 78,000 dead, 300,000 refugees. The Caucasus War, 400,000 dead, 1,200,000 refugees set out. Bulgaria, 260,000 dead. Refugees set out, 505,000. The Eastern War, we have no figure of mortalities. Refugees set out, 70,000. The Balkan Wars, and this is before Bosnia, we're talking about up to 1922. The Balkan Wars, Deaths 1,450,000. Refugees 410,000. Eastern Anatolia 1,190,000 dead, 900,000 refugees. Second Caucasus War, 400,000 dead, 270,000 refugees. Western Anatolia, 1,250,000 deaths, 480,000 refugees. Greece and Bulgaria, up until 1922, refugees 1,200,000. In Western Anatolia, which is now Greece, the Christians destroyed 54,305 buildings, 134,000 horses, 64,000 donkeys and mules, 264,980 cows, 228,230 buffaloes, 8,500 camels, 821,339 goats, and 1,170,000 sheep were killed. That's from the Lausanne Treaty documentation. Therefore, in Europe, and let the President of Turkey and the President of France take note of this. In Europe, in less than a century, we have a conservative figure, profoundly researched, of over 5 million dead Muslims and 5,381,000 refugees. The untold figure is probably in the region of 7 million Muslims killed in Europe, over which a blanket of silence has been placed. This is the crisis which will challenge the Kemalist constitution and state and president, and all of it devolves on their future responsibility to the Kurdish people of the area. Make Fatiha. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Maliki yawmiddin. Iyyaka na'budu wa iyyaka nasta'in. Ihdina as-sirata al-mustaqim. Sirata alladhina an'amta alayhim ghayril maghdubi alayhim waladdallin. Subhana rabbika rabbil izzati amma yasifun. Wa salamun ala al-mursalin. Walhamdulillahi rabbil alamin. Assalamu alaikum.